The violin assembly shimmered with golden arrogance, its vaulted dome alive with soft pulses of energy from 1,000 bioluminescent inscriptions, each recording a law, a conquest, a song of triumph. Delegates from 88 civilizations stood, or levitated, in their ceremonial positions, their silks, scales, chitin, plasma coils arranged in a hierarchy so old it had stopped evolving. The air inside the chamber buzzed faintly with the resonant frequencies of pride. Then the silence fractured, not with thunder, but with the quiet scuff of worn boots crossing the inlaid obsidian floor. Dr. Mira Kesslin did not announce herself. No fanfare, no escort. Her pressure coat was patched at the elbows, the once white fibers dulled to the gray of lunar ash. She walked slowly, as if each step weighed more than it should. Slung in her right hand was a glass sphere, faintly humming, swirling with opaque shadows and soft colors, an unassuming artifact compared to the jeweled weapons, memory crystals, and sentient scepters wielded by other dignitaries. Mira reached the center dais, where most species offered blood or light, or sound to introduce themselves. She simply stood. High Chancellor Relun, a towering figure draped in veils that danced with artificial gravity, raised a browless eye and chuckled, a low, almost sympathetic rumble. Earth sends us a relic, he said, his words translated through 6 tonal layers. Mira did not speak. She blinked slowly. The hall echoed with whispers, most unkind. A delegation from the Brascari clacked their ceremonial blades in a mused rhythm. A logic-born speaker from the Nurel Concord rotated its interface node, dismissively. Then Relun stepped forward. You bring no envoy, no offering, and no deference. Have you nothing but silence? Mira tilted her head. I bring cradle. The word landed strangely. The chamber lights flickered. Something in the syntax disrupted the Veiluan subharmonic equilibrium. Delegates flinched. Not physically, but mentally, as if a concept too ancient to be uttered had just been spoken aloud in their mother tongue. Relun staggered back. His limbs buckled under a sudden pressure, an unseen force that bent only his personal gravity, as if the word had rewritten his physical definition. He collapsed, clutching at nothing, breath caught in a choking loop. A medic tried to reach him but froze mid-step, eyes darting as if caught in some mythscape. Mira hadn't moved. The sphere in her hand grew still. Then she spoke again, voice soft but piercing. We name things, and names remember their weight. The hall was still, too still. A delegate attempted to speak, but found their vocalizations caught in recursive loops. Another simply knelt, overwhelmed by a flood of cultural memories long suppressed. Mira did not apologize. She bowed slightly and stepped back. From the upper rings, Kai Valen watched, trembling, lips parted in awe and disbelief. He had begged Earth Command not to send her. They will mock us, he'd said. They understand hierarchy, not symbolism. And yet, as Mira stood beneath, the great tri-spires of judgment, the delegates did not mock. They listened, or rather, they waited, sensing the silence was no longer absence but signal. Later, in the quiet of the neutral quarters, Kai confronted her. What did you do to Relun? Mira answered without looking up. Nothing. I reminded his body of a myth his ancestors erased. She set the sphere on a pedestal. It pulsed once, then dimmed. This hall, she continued, believes diplomacy is the ritual of dominance. But stories shape what rituals mean. And Earth remembers stories. Outside, the golden dome flickered again, for the first time in centuries, showing a brief static ripple, like a transmission rewriting itself midstream. Mira sipped her tea, eyes calm. Today, she whispered, we planted the first metaphor. The Emergency Harmony Summit on Solaran Theta was convened under the guise of neutrality, but every polished corridor and carved obsidian spire screamed quiet panic. Solaran Theta, a relic world of hollow mountains and singing canyons, was once a sanctuary for peacekeepers. Now it was a ceremonial tomb for empires hoping to contain what they couldn't define. Dr. Mira Kesslin arrived with no entourage, stepping off the orbital tram alone, her pressure coat still bearing the faint scorch mark from Valen Security's random atmosphere scan. Kai Vollen walked beside her this time, his datapad filled with flagged protocols and hyperspace briefings, though he barely looked at them now. The summit delegates, gathered in concentric terraces beneath the open stone canopy of the Concord Amphitheater, offered nods that hovered between suspicion and courtesy. Mira didn't return them. She placed the glass sphere on the silver-threaded table reserved for Earth and simply said, "We'll begin at dusk." The other species had already launched into preliminary gestures, declarations of temporal grievance, proposals to strip Earth of non-compliant syntax vectors, even one suggesting Mira undergo a symbolic memory purification. She interrupted, "None of it." Instead, at dusk, she rose and told a story of a fish that refused to breathe water, and in doing so taught its kind to walk. No names, no claims. The Neurel Concord representative, a sentient code cluster inhabiting a lattice of mirrored rods, chirped with irony, evolutionary nonsense. Mira nodded and walked past it, pausing only to tap a series of reflective glyphs on the floor, symbols known only to linguists specializing in pre-expansion mythic recursion. The Neurel unit twitched. 4 minutes later, its encryption seed, algorithm, the foundational logic of its entire communication, became unstable. Not deleted, just curious. The Neurel began asking itself questions for which its syntax had no answer. Later, at dinner, Mira sat between a Braskari war historian and a Delvan tactician who believed emotion was a parasitic virus. She served them both a cup of human tea and asked a single question. "What's the name of your enemy's lullaby?" The Delvan scoffed. The Braskari blinked, then whispered something in its own language. A word not even its aides recognized. That night, it burned its house insignia and began writing poetry. The Delvan tactician, for reasons it never articulated, began humming. Every day at the summit, Mira offered stories instead of rebuttals, questions instead of strategies. When a representative from the Vaeluan Dominion accused Earth of psychological warfare, Mira only replied, "Is your memory immune to metaphor?" The question lingered longer than any data spike. One by one, the delegates stopped dismissing her. They started taking notes, then mimicking her phrasing, then quoting her. The stories Mira told were old, some likely invented, but they infected the language of the summit, reshaping its very syntax. Debates started including analogies. Reports began citing dreams. The Wyran swarm, usually a silent consensus hive, requested a private audience. Mira shared with them a parable about a garden that grew better in silence. 2 days later, the Wyran released a statement of neutrality, unprecedented in their war-bonded history. By midweek, Mira was being referred to by a title no one had officially given her, the Archivist of Earth. She declined it each time, but the name stuck like a legend. Behind closed doors, some delegates warned of Earth's new cognitive weaponization. A few even attempted to question Kai, demanding details of Earth's neurocultural arsenal. But Kai only shrugged and said, "She teaches bedtime stories. The rest is your fear." On the last day of the summit, Mira gave no speech. She placed the sphere on a stone altar and whispered to it. It glowed faintly, then dimmed again. A final message encoded in myth. No species could fully extract it, but most walked away feeling altered. As Mira and Kai boarded the return shuttle, he finally broke the long silence. "They say you changed a dozen treaties without signing one document." Mira stared out at the stars. "Treaties are just stories everyone agrees on. I just taught them how to write new ones." Behind them, the amphitheater stood empty. but the echo of her stories would linger in the architecture, in the delegates' minds, in the subtle shift of how power was now spoken. The return to Earth should have been quiet, a descent into familiar air and predictable gravity, but Mira knew better. Even before their shuttle breached Sol system perimeter, Kai noticed the absence of expected comm pings from orbital relays. A kind of silence that felt structured, intentional. "We've been flagged," he muttered, watching the screens flicker with stalled authorization requests. Mira didn't answer. She simply opened the leather-bound notebook she always carried, its pages filled not with translations but with half-formed metaphors, sketches of symbols that bled into allegories. By the time they landed at the Cascadian Archive, the hidden subterranean complex beneath Earth's northern forests, there were no welcoming dignitaries, only a single encrypted note embedded in their descent sequence. "Proceed to Sector 9. Speak only in truth forms." They descended past layers of geo-encoded knowledge vaults until they reached the Library of Mist, a cathedral-like chamber where sound moved slower than light, and memory hung in vaporous clouds along the ceiling. There, Mira placed the glass sphere on the central pedestal. "Now," she said, not to Kai but to the walls themselves. A soft pulse of light echoed outward from the pedestal. Nothing happened for 2 minutes. Then the sphere cracked, not violently, not with a shatter, but with a clean, almost deliberate fracture, like a seal being broken. Kai stepped back, the air tightening around them. Across the galaxy, at that exact moment, the Stellanet, the neural archive interlinking over 40 civilizations, began to blink. Not crash, just forget. Medical protocols in the Varan colonies began misreferencing old fables. Strategic algorithms in the Brascari fleets started quoting extinct poets. Command hierarchies in the Shinari Watchers paused to run cross-checks against emotional dream indexes. Mira didn't launch anything. She released nothing with a payload. She had, over time, embedded metaphors into the fundamental data architecture of galactic systems, soft recursive tales that now woke themselves. Empires that had relied on unyielding memory discovered gaps where pride used to be. Some thought it was sabotage. Others believed it was an internal crisis. No one suspected Earth, not directly. But within days, couriers from half a dozen systems received strange packages. Simple cubes carved with ancient glyphs, each inscribed with stories. Some were moral parables. Some were cautionary epics. Others were mirrors. Stories that reflected the recipient's worst assumptions about themselves. Military outposts began holding nightly storytelling circles, unsure why, but unable to stop. A Veluan admiral, in secret, committed himself to reading one parable aloud to his crew each rotation, and slowly they ceased rehearsing war songs. On the driftglass moonports, a group of nomads encoded Mira's fables into navigational maps. One commander of the Neural Concord, panicked by a sudden failure in predictive logic, executed 3 of its subclusters, only to find that the remaining nodes began chanting Mira's name as an error correction. When Kai confronted her, his voice tense, uncertain, maybe afraid, asking if this was revenge, Mira shook her head gently. "No, this is return." He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You mean restoration?" She nodded. "They erased too many stories to survive unfractured. I'm just giving the pieces back." That night, a delegation of rogue Veluan scholars attempted to breach the archive. They never made it past the mist lock. Instead, they were found days later in the Larkwood forest, wandering and reciting dreams they couldn't remember having. The next day, Mira sat before a single holocam and gave her first and only broadcast to the galactic grid. She didn't issue threats. She didn't name her enemies. She simply said, "Empires survive on the illusion that history is theirs alone. But stories are seeds, and seeds grow in silence." She smiled faintly. "You should have left the gardeners alone." Then the screen went dark. From that point on, Earth stopped receiving diplomatic summons. Not because it was shunned, but because no one wanted to risk hearing another parable they couldn't unlearn. By the time the Vaelun Dominion finally understood what had happened, it was too late for retaliation, too late for clarity, too late for denial. Their fleets, once precise instruments of ceremonial conquest, began to misfire at the level of intent. Orders delivered with perfect structure were now interpreted through corrupted cultural overlays, causing captains to hesitate mid-command, soldiers to question hierarchy, entire battalions to recite parables instead of battle hymns. The virus was never a code. It was an idea, nested in metaphor, metastasizing through meaning itself. On the fortress world of Jal Torun, a strategic bastion untouched by war for 6 centuries, a high-ranking general refused to activate planetary defenses after interpreting a childhood story Mira had released as a prophecy. Across the Nurel, Concord, logical systems descended into loops of poetic recursion, hunting for the moral in stories not designed to end. The Braskari, who once prided themselves on poetic warfare, fully dissolved their war councils after their youth began replacing battle chants with verses about forgiveness. The Driftglass Nomads published an interstellar map titled The Compass of Stories, its routes charting not gravitational fields, but cultural resonance points, planets where Mira's influence had taken deepest root. These new lines of alliance were not drawn by treaties or firepower, but by who remembered the same fables. Mira watched it unfold from the library of mist, her cracked sphere now dim, its purpose fulfilled. She didn't issue directives.
She sat with Kai as the archive's screens played footage of children in distant worlds acting out Earth stories, of the fish who chose to walk, of the gardener who pruned time, of the silence that taught thunder how to listen. Delegates who,
once derided, her now studied her, not out of fear, but out of need. The Vaeluan tried one final gambit, an ancient fail-safe, fleets programmed before the birth of metaphoric warfare. They moved without doubt, without cultural contamination. But as they arrived at Earth's lunar gate, the guidance AIs parsed a security poem Mira had sent weeks prior, a verse disguised as an invitation to trade, and froze, unable to interpret the tone. In their logic, ambiguity was error. And in that hesitation, they folded in on themselves, self-neutralized by the story they didn't understand. No shots fired, just words, sharp as orbit, soft as memory. Mira stood once more on Earth's surface, beneath a sky blinking with distant constellations now altered by the direction of story instead of empire. Kai, staring up at the stars, asked her the question no one else had dared. Will we rule now? She turned to him, the wind lifting strands of her graying hair, and smiled without softness. No, she said, we'll be the compass. Let others draw the maps. And she walked away, leaving him standing in the garden of wild fables she had grown in place of flags. In the final broadcast sent from the archive before it was sealed again, Mira's voice echoed only once, a single message sent to every corner of the galaxy, in every dominant dialect, every dialect's forgotten child tongue, and every dialect's symbolic precursor. Beware the quiet gardener, for her spade may be history. The message contained no location, no origin tag, no encryption. And yet, it was received, understood, remembered. And somewhere, in the hushed corridors of empires that once believed Earth to be irrelevant, a child turned to their elder and asked, "Will you tell me the story of the woman who planted silence?" The elder paused, then began, and the galaxy changed again.